The Rhetoric of Empire. Colonial Discourse in Journalism, Travel Writing, and Imperial Administration. Introduction. The formal end of European colonialism during the latter half of the 20th century has, in more recent years, given rise to a new range of studies devoted to re-examining the history, politics, psychology, and language of colonization. Within the field of literary study alone, scholars have experienced a major paradigm shift in which literary works, once studied primarily as expressions of traditionally Western ideals, are now also read as evidence of the manner in which such ideals have served in the historical process of colonization. The particular languages which belong to this process, enabling it while simultaneously being generated by it, are known collectively as colonial discourse. In the following chapters, I propose to identify the basic rhetorical features of this discourse and to study the way in which it has been deployed both in the modern period of European colonialism, roughly 1870 to 1960, as well as in the more recent period of decolonization. My study, which draws its examples primarily from British, French, and American writing of the 19th and 20th centuries, offers a general introduction to modern European colonial discourse, rather than focusing on a more narrowly defined historical moment or geographical area. It emphasizes rhetorical analysis rather than historical narrative, and while borrowing from the language of contemporary literary theory, it carries this analysis beyond the boundaries of literature into other forms of writing. In the course of this study, it will become clear that what we call colonial discourse is neither a monolithic system nor a finite set of texts. It may more accurately be described as the name for a series of colonizing discourses, each adapted to a specific historical situation, yet having in common certain elements with the others. This series is marked by internal repetition, but not by all-encompassing totality. It is a series that continues, in some forms, through what we would call the post-colonial world of today. In speaking of colonial discourse, one necessarily treads on unstable ground. One seeks to identify the colonizing gestures in language, while recognizing the impossibility of containing them within a bounded textual field. My discussion, then, will take place on a kind of border terrain, within an area of tension between definition and powerlessness to define, between containment of my subject and recognition of its uncontained plurality. The problematic nature of this subject has required imaginative and often non-traditional critical approaches. In the English-speaking world alone, a number of studies in recent years have begun to create new knowledge about colonial discourse and its variations, such as Orientalist, Africanist, and primitivist discourse. Edward Said, Christopher Miller, and Patrick Brantlinger have examined the discourses of colonialism primarily in canonical works of English and French literature and in popular adventure novels. James Clifford and Mariana Turgovnik have written provocatively on the connections between 20th century literature, art, and ethnography. Mary Louise Pratt has written a comprehensive study of travel writing as part of the history of European imperialism since the Renaissance. Sara Suleri has studied the rhetoric of the British in India. Ashish Nandi has given new life to the study of the psychology of colonization. Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha have helped to formulate theoretical models for what promises to be an ever-renewing intellectual project. My own work, which is indebted to all these writers, seeks both a return to basic principles of rhetorical study and an expansion of the field of inquiry into certain new areas. I have found most of my examples in literary and popular journalism and in related genres such as exploration narratives, travel writing, and the memoirs of colonial officials. My focus on nonfiction writing is motivated by a desire to examine the discourse in a form unmediated by the consciously aesthetic requirements of imaginative literature. Journalism is distinguished from fiction by the conventional expectation of its grounding in an historical actuality. Its relation to this actuality is understood to be primarily metonymic and historically referential, rather than metaphoric and self-referential. Nonfiction writing in general often combines this metonymic quality with an absence of formal closure, so that it opens directly onto the fractures and contradictions of colonialist epistemology. However, I also try to show how journalism and other forms of nonfiction, despite conventional expectation, depend on the use of myth, symbol, metaphor, and other rhetorical procedures more often associated with fiction and poetry. Thus, I present non-fiction writing, and literary journalism in particular, as the means for staging an introductory analysis of colonial discourse. The questions to which I continually return are the following. How does the Western writer construct a coherent representation out of the strange and, to the writer, often incomprehensible realities confronted in the non-Western world? What are the cultural, ideological, or literary presuppositions upon which such a construct is based? My exploration of these questions involves two basic procedures. A mapping of the discourse, which identifies a series of basic tropes which emerge from the Western colonial experience, and B, an informal genealogy, in which the repetitions and variations of these tropes are seen to operate across a range of 19th and 20th century contexts. These basic procedures are accompanied throughout by a reflection on the nature of writing itself, not only as an epistemic violence and a colonizing order, but also, to cite Michel Foucault, as that which opens up a whole field of responses, reactions, results, and possible inventions, including the subversion of its own order. I have devoted a chapter to each of 12 rhetorical modes, or ways of writing about non-Western peoples. Taken together, these constitute a kind of repertoire for colonial discourse, a range of tropes, conceptual categories, and logical operations available for purposes of representation. Since these rhetorical modes are not confined to journalism, I have also occasion to cite their occurrence in such genres as essays in political and moral philosophy and documents in colonial administration. In doing so, I wish to suggest that journalism follows on more systematic orders of discourse, adapting them to particular events and translating them into a language of popular appeal. Journalistic language is a kind of palimpsest, underneath which the texts of Rousseau, Diderot, or Carlyle lie just barely effaced. These rhetorical modes, however, must be understood as more than merely literary or philosophical. They are the tropes that come into play with the establishment and maintenance of colonial authority, or, as sometimes happens, those that register the loss of such authority. There is nothing especially conscious or intentional in their use. They are part of the landscape in which relations of power manifest themselves. As in any organizing taxonomy, this project involves a certain degree of abstraction, not to say reduction. It subordinates the complexity and discreteness of any moment to the need for understanding it within a larger context. If I find that the language of the French in Algeria conforms in certain ways to that of the British in India or the Americans in the Philippines, it is not that I choose to ignore the substantial differences, political, cultural, ideological, geographical, which distinguish these encounters from one another. Rather, given the obvious differences, I have instead tried to identify the unexpected parallels and the common genealogies that unite these apparently disparate occasions of discourse. Taking historical difference as a matter of course, I have looked for lines of convergence, correspondence, and analogy. By the same token, the list of rhetorical modes, which provide titles for the following chapters, should not be considered definitive. There may be other modes or other ways of defining the ones I have designated, nor should they be understood as entirely discrete from one another. On the contrary, they overlap continually, and certain tropes might be classified as subcategories of others. What I have called the rhetorical strategies of debasement, for example, is a form of negation in the sense that it negates the value of the order. Likewise, the trope of idealization, in practice, often merges with aestheticization, just as the figure of the noble savage represents both a philosophical and an aesthetic ideal. This slippage between categories is probably inevitable to any rhetorical taxonomy, including classical treatises on rhetorical figures. It is to be hoped that the imprecisions of this procedure may be tolerated, however, in the interests of describing the nature of a discourse whose forms are related, as in all writing, by both repetition and difference. Having sketched a general outline of my project, I would now like to consider more closely some of its critical assumptions. In writing about Claude Lévi-Strauss's studies of the Indians of Western Brazil, Jacques Derrida has identified what he calls the anthropological war, the essential confrontation that opens communication between peoples and cultures, even when that communication is not practiced under the banner of colonial or military oppression. Derrida argues that the writing produced by this confrontation always involves a violence of the letter, imposed by one culture upon the other. A violence, in other words, of difference, of classification, and of the system of appellations. The very process by which one culture subordinates another begins in the act of naming and leaving unnamed, of marking on an unknown territory the lines of division and uniformity, of boundary and continuity. One already sees that this notion of the anthropological war extends beyond anthropology as a discipline and beyond the initial confrontation of cultures. In its broadest sense, it includes the entire system by which one culture comes to interpret, to represent, and finally to dominate another. It includes, in other words, the discourses of colonialism, as produced in such forms as imaginative literature, journalism, travel writing, ethnographic description, historiography, political speeches, administrative documents, and statutes of law. Culture and colonization are etymologically as well as historically related. Both derive from the Latin colere, to cultivate, to inhabit, and to take care of a place. The Latin colonus designated both a farmer or husbandman and a member of a settlement of Roman citizens, or colonia, in a hostile or newly conquered country, while cultura referred both to tilling the soil and to refinement in education and civilization. Modern uses of colony and colonialism are no less ambiguous and multivalent than their Latin roots. The British divided their colonies into three classes: crown colonies, colonies with representative governments, and those with responsible governments, designating increasingly indirect forms of crown rule. Colonies with responsible governments were eligible for elevation to dominion status. An equally diverse range applied to the French Empire under the Third Republic, 1871 to 1940, where the Ministry of Colonies ruled most territories, but Algeria, considered part of France itself, came under the Ministry of the Interior, and Tunisia and Morocco under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. European colonies in general were unofficially divided between those established for the control of resources and populations, French Indochina, the Belgian Congo, Dutch Indonesia, the United States Philippines, and those designed for the settlement of Europeans, Algeria, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Just as the Romans saw the establishment of overseas colonies as part of the larger designs of their empire, it is still possible to distinguish colonialism from imperialism as part from whole. Benito Parry thus writes of colonialism as a specific and the most spectacular mode of imperialism's many and mutable states, one which preceded the rule of international finance capitalism, and whose formal ending, imperialism, has survived. In speaking of the discourse of colonialism, however, the distinction tends to collapse, since the basic principles of this discourse, rooted in the very foundations of Western culture, also constitute the discourse of imperialism. Imperialism has survived the formal ending of colonial rule, but so has colonial discourse. Theories of colonialism and colonial discourse begin by combining the various historical instances of colonization under the rubric of the colonial situation, a notion for which the French anthropologist Georges Balandier provided a classic definition in 1963. According to Balandier, the colonial situation is characterized by the domination imposed by a foreign minority, racially and culturally different, over a materially weaker indigenous majority in the name of a racial or ethnic and cultural superiority. A set of relations is put into place between two cultures, one fast-moving, technologically advanced, and economically powerful, the other slow-moving, and without advanced technology or a complex economy. These relations are antagonized by the instrumental role which the colonized society is forced to play, so that in order to maintain its authority, the colonizing society resorts not only to force, but also to a series of pseudo-justifications and stereotyped behaviors. Balandier thus sees the colonial situation as one of latent crisis, an order maintained precariously by ideology and representation, as well as by formal administration. Contemporary critics would question some of Balandier's assumptions, the notion of technological and economic advancement, for example, or the insistence on a simple binary division between one culture and the other. Most would agree, however, in the value of a theoretical model for the colonial situation as something that exists in the real world, and that linguistic representation belongs to it, either as an instrument of colonial rule or, more fundamentally, as the set of signs in which the colonial situation can be read. In pointing out that the essential confrontation of cultures marking the colonial situation extends beyond the banner of colonial rule itself, Derrida recalls Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony and the power of ruling ideas which continue to hold sway outside the historical and institutional limits of direct domination. My own study treats colonial discourse as belonging both to the classic colonial situation and to the more elusive, more powerful forces of cultural hegemony in the post-colonial world. Post-colonial is a word that engenders even more debate than colonial, in part because of the ambiguous relation between these two. In the pages that follow, I shall refer to the post-colonial in two ways: as an historical situation marked by the dismantling of traditional institutions of colonial power, and as a search for alternatives to the discourses of the colonial era. The first is an object of empirical knowledge. New flags fly, new political formations come into being. The second is both an intellectual project and a transcultural condition that includes, along with new possibilities, certain crises of identity and representation. Gayatri Spivak, for example, an Indian-born American academic, speaks movingly of her estrangement both from Western liberalism and from the indigenous peoples of her native country. But in neither the historical nor the cultural sense does the post-colonial mark a clean break with the colonial. The relations of colonizer to colonized have neither remained the same nor have they disappeared. The instability of the colonial-post-colonial divide belongs to discourse as well. With this instability always in mind, my concentration is on writing itself rather than on other manifestations of colonial rule. Returning for a moment to that classical situation, one can see a metaphorical relation between the writer and the colonizer. The problem of the colonizer is in some sense the problem of the writer. In the face of what may appear as a vast cultural and geographical blankness, colonization is a form of self-inscription onto the lives of a people who are conceived of as an extension of the landscape. For the colonizer as for the writer, it becomes a question of establishing authority through the demarcation of identity and difference. Members of a colonizing class will insist on their radical difference from the colonized as a way of legitimizing their own position in the colonial community. But at the same time, they will insist, paradoxically, on the colonized people's essential identity with them, both as preparation for the domestication of the colonized and as a moral and philosophical precondition for the civilizing mission. The colonizer's traditional insistence on difference from the colonized establishes a notion of the savage as other, the antithesis of civilized value. And yet the tendency of modern literature and science has been to locate the savage within us, in our historical origins and in our psychic structure. As modern, civilized human beings, we assert authority over the savage both within us and abroad, but the very energy devoted to such an assertion acknowledges its own incompleteness as authority. When we obey or are obeyed, how much of that obedience is mere mimicry? Colonial discourse bears this constant uncertainty, leading to an inherent confusion of identity and difference, a simultaneous avowal and disavowal of its own authority. This fundamental instability makes for a rich profusion of rhetorical forms, which often clash with one another, and yet which all enter equally into the matrix of relations of power that characterizes the colonial situation. The crisis-ridden, unstable context of colonial power makes for a shattering of its discourse, not unlike the profusion of different voices in a paranoid schizophrenic, or in the wasteland. Colonial discourse, despite its rather constant functioning in serving the forces of order, actually assumes a number of widely divergent rhetorical forms, like a series of fragments made by stress fractures under the burden of colonial authority. It will be apparent by now that I use the phrase colonial discourse to designate a space within language that exists both as a series of historical instances and as a series of rhetorical functions. Historically speaking, the phrase refers to the language employed by representatives of the great colonial powers in establishing authority over vast regions of Africa, Asia, the South Pacific, and Latin America during the period of imperial expansion that reached its height at the end of the 19th century. But I have written a rhetorical study rather than a history, and thus have attempted to describe the aspects of this language which survive beyond the classic colonial era and which continue to color perceptions of the non-Western world. Here I follow Paul de Man's notion of rhetoric as being not just the study of tropes and figures, but also as a procedure that suspends the internal logic of a given trope in order to place it within a larger narrative framework which includes the history of literature and of philosophical thinking. Any given trope can thus be read as part of a pattern of repetition. De Man's theory of the grammatization of rhetoric implies that the trope will implicitly claim its own subjective and independent status, while a critical deconstruction shows its syntagmatic position within a narrative pattern, as well as its declension from a set of historically determined concepts and categories. Thus, a vast thematic and semiotic network is revealed that structures the entire narrative and that remained invisible to a reader caught in naive metaphorical mystification. Although de Man refers specifically to literary narratives, the critical procedure he defines is applicable to non-literary texts, as well as to the hybrid known as literary journalism. Given my reliance on literary journalism for examples of colonial discourse, it may be useful to say something about the discursive specificity of this kind of writing. My initial attraction to literary journalism is better explained autobiographically than theoretically. Having worked as a journalist in more than one European country before moving into the study of literature and critical theory, I began with a personal as well as intellectual interest in the interpretation of cultures. These interests combined with a sense of living in a moment of historical urgency. Interpretation had real consequences for living people who had little control over how they were represented to more powerful nations and cultures. The study of fiction, while obviously relevant to questions of cultural interpretation, seemed at a formal and aesthetic remove from the historical reality of the post-colonial situation. The material of the daily news media, on the other hand, was, in Walter Benjamin's phrase, so shot through with explanation, so transparently the expression of ideology, as to obviate the need for critical intervention. The news media's reliance on institutional sources, their place in a market economy, and their standardized discourse produce an ideology that is fairly easily explained, e.g. in Said's Covering Islam, in terms of national policy and public opinion. Literary journalism, however, combines an immediate historical interest with the complex layering of figurative language that conventionally belongs to imaginative literature. It often has a symbolic character that, in comparison with journalism as information, tends to multiply its possible levels of meaning. The presence of the writer as part of the narrative scene, moreover, conceals the most obvious effects of ideology and suppresses the historical dimension of the interpretive categories that are brought into play. The writer implicitly claims a subjective and independent status, free from larger patterns of interpretation and deriving authority from the direct encounter with real events. This authority, of course, is as problematic as the claim to a subjective and independent status in interpretation. At the risk of betraying an ontological naivete, one may say that this writing is about things that really happen, no matter how they are interpreted, and that on another level it is about the struggle with events not entirely within the writer's control. There is, in journalism, an element of subordination to the aleatory nature of the event, not present in the relative mastery of the fiction writer over the invention and ordering of narrative events. The journalist also relies on narrative as a resistance to the aleatory, but this is a defensive position in comparison to the novelist's more creative and even capricious power. Essentially, this point is made by T.S. Eliot in an essay which demonstrates the impossibility of distinguishing journalism from imaginative literature on a scale of literary value. Swift's Drapier's Letters and Newman's Apologia pro vita sua, both literary journalism to Eliot, are infinitely superior on such a scale to a second-rate novel. For Eliot, then, the distinction is futile on grounds of textual form and can only be made by referring to the circumstances of composition. The journalist writes under the pressure of an immediate occasion. Eliot's move has the effect of displacing questions of form with those of practice when making critical distinctions. It evokes an image of the literary journalist as caught within the play of more powerful forces, yet laying claim to a space of interpretive authority within that field. The task of criticism, then, would be to demystify the grounds of that authority by defining its conditions and its place within a larger, unacknowledged discursive framework. A final distinction between literary journalism and fiction seems to be made possible by the existence, in the former case, of alternate frames of historical reference. Graham Greene's The Lawless Roads, 1939, is a non-fiction account of his journey through the tropical Mexican states of Chiapas and Tabasco, where, under the socialist regime of Lázaro Cárdenas, Catholic churches had been destroyed and priests driven out or shot. This text provides the setting and theme for Greene's novel The Power and the Glory, 1940. One difference between these two texts is the lack, in the former, of any implied distance between the author and the first-person narrator. Like most literary journalism, it is avowedly autobiographical. More important, however, is the fact that the reader of The Lawless Roads can compare it to other historical accounts of southern Mexico under the Cardenas regime. Without doubting the truth of Greene's personal account, we can nonetheless question his interpretation in the light of rival accounts and can connect it to Greene's extra-literary affiliations. In this case, the work was commissioned by the Catholic Church. Of course, we can do the same with The Power and the Glory, and we do it all the time, but only by violating the terms of the novelistic convention which would protect it from being read as historical representation. We have to read the novel, in other words, as if it were The Lawless Roads. One could also argue, however, that the convention of fictional ahistoricity is violated by Greene himself in writing a novel with a historical setting. The distinction between the novel and literary journalism on grounds of historical referentiality turns out not to be so clear, after all. Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a work which serves as a continual point of reference in the succeeding chapters, offers another case study in the problem of historical referentiality. Conrad's suppression of any direct reference to Africa or the Congo has the effect of universalizing his narrative, making it possible to read it as a statement of the human condition, rather than as simply an account of conditions in the Belgian Congo in the early 20th century. Fictional conventions thus enable a universalizing metaphor that we do not ordinarily grant to literary journalism, which is read as localized in time and place. Criticism, however, has the power both of historically localizing fictional narrative and, conversely, of expanding the frame of reference belonging to nonfiction. Thus, Heart of Darkness has been read as incorporating the racism of men, like Conrad, who took part in the work of colonizing the Congo, while journalistic narratives, like Henry Morton Stanley's In Darkest Africa, 1891, can be read metonymically as part of a long history of representations of the Congo. The irony of this particular case is that Heart of Darkness tells us more about what the Belgian Congo was really like than any journalistic or historical account. The study of discourse, however, explodes these categories of genre in the effort to seize hold of a more global system of representation. The question that matters for this study is, finally, not how one literary form differs from another, but how writing works, in whatever form, to produce knowledge of other cultures. That is why, at the risk of failing to show the proper respect for literary distinctions, I have freely drawn together examples from so many different kinds of text, treating them as moments in the production of a larger discursive phenomenon. In addition to transgressing boundaries of literary form, the study of discourse also recognizes an inherent ambiguity in the relation between author and text. The text speaks ambiguously. Is it the voice of an individual writer, the voice of an institutional authority, of cultural ideology? It is all of these things, often at the same time. In the colonial situation, as well as in its aftermath, this ambiguity in writing itself joins with the logical incoherence of colonial discourse to produce a rhetoric characterized by constant crisis, just as colonial rule itself continually creates its own crisis of authority. The anxiety of colonial discourse comes from the fact that the colonizer's power depends on the presence, not to say consent, of the colonized. What is power without its object? Authority is in some sense conferred by those who obey it. That they do so under extreme forms of constraint does not change their place in the balance. their indispensable role in granting authority its proper value. Hence the uneasiness, the instability, the frequent hysteria of colonial discourse. There is no real center to this discourse, apart from the historically central motive that authority must be maintained. But even the nature of this authority changes from one era to the next. The intense and localized colonial administration of 50 years ago, for example, has shifted to a more indirect and global supervision of third world political and economic development. Colonial discourse thus does not simply reproduce an ideology or a set of ideas that must constantly be repeated. It is rather a way of creating and responding to reality that is infinitely adaptable in its function of preserving the basic structures of power. Foucault makes a similar point. There is not, on the one side, a discourse of power, and opposite it, another discourse that runs counter to it. Discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. Discourse may be understood here as a series of discontinuous segments that combine in various ways in the service of power. But power should no more be conceived as a monolithic structure than discourse. Foucault asks us to think of power not as simply the privilege of law, prohibition, and sovereignty, but as a multiple and mobile field of force relations, wherein far-reaching, but never completely stable, effects of domination are produced. Would it be possible to create a discourse that avoids the violence of the letter, and thus the imposition of power? This question, the occasion of my final chapter, has also been asked by James Clifford of ethnography. Clifford finds that the textual embodiment of authority is a recurring problem even for contemporary experiments that replace traditional models of ethnographic description and interpretation. Any coherent presentation in itself presupposes a controlling model of authority. The same question applies to other forms of writing. In the description and interpretation of the non-Western world, it is not only the non-Western point of view that must be entertained. It is rather an alternate symbolic universe that must be imagined, or whose existence must at least be recognized. Here the writer must allow for a certain self-inflicted sabotage, a disruption of the categories that govern conventional interpretation. Even so, it may be impossible to break free from these categories and still produce a meaningful text. However, if, as Pierre Bourdieu remarks, there is no way out of the game of culture, there are still lessons to be learned from criticism. Criticism, and the interpretation of cultures as criticism, will not free us from the relations of power inherent in all discourse, but at least they may help us to know the consequences of that power.